Well, the election results were disappointing for our pro-democracy movement. As of recording this on November 18th, 2024, the presidency, the Senate, and the Congress have gone to the MAGA Republican side. And with a 6-3 Supreme Court, the forces of authoritarianism and dictatorship have captured the three branches of the federal government. Like you, I've experienced a whole gamut of emotions. Grief for our democracy, panic for the continued loss of our rights, and a trigger response to seeing an abuser-in-chief about to take the White House with a lawless cadre hanging off his coattails. All of which leads to a continued unmooring of my sense of myself as an American. With the 2016 election result, I felt the tectonic plates beneath my feet shift, but my identity as an American remained intact. With this 2024 result, I feel like a stranger in a strange land. The America I thought I knew is not the America I live in. And how can I call myself an American when America as an idea no longer stands for democracy? There's a theory that the anti-incumbency election results all over the democratic world was due to a lack of trust in our democratic institutions and a disbelief in democracy itself as a viable form of government. This repudiation in America has led those in the pro-democracy movement to lose trust in our fellow citizens. That broken trust won't be easily healed as our pro-democracy coalition lays in tatters around us. All that being said, I appreciate you tuning into this podcast as you struggle with the ramifications of this most recent election. What we're going through is hard, and listening to the following interview with Kamala Lopez will be hard in moments as well. Kamala Lopez is one of the most inspiring people I've ever met, so her story is full of incremental progress, but she's also very real about the forces pitted against equality in our country. It's a sobering picture. Be warned that about 50 minutes in, there's very sensitive material shared about how the legal system fails women again and again. I mentioned a trigger warning beforehand, so keep your ears peeled in case you have young ones listening or in case you're sensitive to issues dealing with sexual violence. I will have the exact timings in the show notes so you can skip ahead to more hopeful material. Please take care of your mental health in any way you can. Also, please note that this interview was recorded in October before the election, but in many ways is prescient to what we're going through now. And now for the interview. Welcome to the Ground Game podcast. Today we are joined by Kamala Lopez. I first met Kamala at a writer's retreat where she was drumming up support for a Kickstarter campaign, which eventually became the documentary film Equal Means Equal, a film about how women don't have equal rights or protections under the law in the United States of America because the Equal Rights Amendment hasn't been codified yet. Full transparency, I've been donating to Kamala's Kickstarter and campaign and am very personally invested in passing the ERA. As most people I talk to aren't aware of women's second-class status per our Constitution and legal system, I'm excited to talk politics with Kamala. Welcome, Kamala.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thank you for supporting my work all these years. I'm very grateful.
It was a no-brainer, really. When you first pitched it to me outside in the courtyard at the writer's retreat, I was like, first of all, I was one of those people who wasn't aware that women had second-class status until you brought it up with your Kickstarter. And then I kind of became a mini evangelist in my circle about it. So I am very excited to broaden the audience for this information and letting people know just what's going on. And so let's start from the very beginning. Were you always interested in politics?
I actually was always interested in what I thought politics was. which apparently is very different than what politics actually is. I went to Yale as a declared political science major, and after one political science class, I immediately knew that I could not tolerate the way that politics was presented to students and to people that presumably were going to go into this. And so I switched my major to philosophy, which seemed more in line with what I thought politics was, which was really about helping people, helping large groups of people by thinking properly and then designing systems that would help people. But in fact, that apparently is not at all what politics is. And it's been difficult to really face what politics is in this country. Even the most well-meaning people that get involved are, from my point of view, looking at this, are eventually dragged into the mire of the way it's run and find themselves not living up to their principles. So it's quite demoralizing.
Did you have a background in politics other than, the one class in college before this project?
No, I've always been rather of an activist in the sense that if I thought something was unjust or wrong or bothered me, I didn't sit on the sidelines. So to the degree that that is what I feel politics is getting involved in your society and trying to improve it. I've always been a political animal, but as far as taking on something as monumental as the Equal Rights Amendment, no, I had not done that before, and I really underestimated the force that was pitted against this fight.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, it's still, I probably met you in 2007, 8, 9, that era, and you're still fighting the good fight. I mean, it's taking a really long time, way longer than it should, when you consider what we're fighting for.
That's absolutely right. It's a travesty that basic human and civil rights are denied from over 50% of our population. And I would argue that it's mostly because of public ignorance, gaslighting, misinformation, or a misunderstanding of what equality is. I think a lot of people interpret equality to mean that they're going to lose something, especially if they're in power positions. And since people in power tend to want to remain there, they're very afraid of losing status. I think that that's a big part of what we're fighting against is that. And then the vast majority of the people, over 85% of them, I believe, who think that women are already included in our Constitution and are already equal. And that's something that the US government shamelessly promotes by going all over the world and telling other countries how they should treat their women. It's really in poor taste, you know.
Yeah, I mean, we'll get into this later, but we've actually gotten international courts have actually ruled that America's been in violation of women's rights in more than one case, in very, very heartbreaking cases. But we'll get into that later because I mean, when you get into the nitty gritty of it, it's just an absolute scandal. It really is.
Really is. It really is. And it's so infuriating to not be able to communicate that to the vast population who I'm almost 100% certain were they to understand it the way that you and I understand it, they wouldn't stand for it. And so we have to find a way to get out of our silos. We have to find a way to release this information in a way that people are able to comprehend it. But in order to do that, I think the main issue is that we're fighting a great deal of capital and a great deal of power, for whom the status quo makes a lot of money, and to say nothing of keeps, I sometimes hate to use the word patriarchy because it's got so much sort of baggage around it, but it is truly the failure of the ERA to be adopted is what keeps the patriarchy in place. With the ERA, it would crumble. It wouldn't be able to be sustained.
At least in terms of the legal structures that sustain it. Yeah.
That's correct. And I think, as we've seen many times, certainly with civil rights and gay rights and so forth, as the law moves, so the population's perception of something that may have been, not fashionable changes, not immediately, but if we look, and I'm not saying that minorities in this country have an easy time of it by any stretch, but if you look at my field, which is acting, and your field, writing, and you just look at the landscape of public media or what's being given to the public to absorb. When I started, you couldn't find an African American or Latino lead on any television show or in any film. And now you would have a difficult time finding a show that did not have at least one character that was of a minority ethnicity. And so I do think that these things take time, but I do think they change. And the first thing has to be the law, because as we will discuss, the legal system is so biased against us, and we have no recourse when we go to the Supreme Court. We have, as Alito said when he handed down Dobbs, there is no textual basis for what you ask for. That was false, as we know, because the ERA is the textual basis, and the ERA was law at the time that Dobbs came down. But because of the ignorance and the misinformation, he was able to get away with it. The fact of the matter is that right now, today, women have the right to control their bodies under the Equal Rights Amendment. But unfortunately, it behooves politicians, because ultimately politicians are after two things. One is money and two is votes. And both of those things are garnered by terrifying women and telling them that they're going to lose this, that, and the other thing, when in fact, what they should be doing is simply saying, no, you have these rights, they must be enforced. And the first step to enforce these rights is for the president to do what is legally required of him in the take care clause of his executive duties, and that is to make sure that all the laws are faithfully executed. When the ERA became federal law on January 27th of 2020, we began to live in an unconstitutional and criminal reign by first the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, who both refuse to do what is required, which is simply publish the ERA so that the courts can be on notice that it must be enforced and adopted.
So for the audience members who maybe don't know what the ERA is and don't know the history of it, because a lot of people don't, could you explain exactly what the Equal Rights Amendment calls for and a little bit about the history?
Certainly. So when women got the vote in 1920, the next step was seen widely by all activists to be equality under law. And the Equal Rights Amendment was written by Alice Paul and her friend. And it states, equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. It's something that is in constitutions worldwide. We're a real outlier in not having that in our constitution. Not to say that it's perfectly enforced everywhere, because it isn't, but one of the main reasons that it isn't is because the big dog on the block, which is us, hasn't even put it into their constitution. So the Equal Rights Amendment was written in 1923, but it didn't ever it got voted on very, very rarely. until the 60s and 70s, when there was a real push for women's liberation, as they called it at the time. And the ERA did get passed by the US Congress, and it was signed by the President Nixon at the time. What people don't understand, and that's because our system is a little bit complicated, is that we can pass something in the federal Congress, but an amendment must be subsequently ratified by 3/4 of the states in order to become law. But unfortunately, what happened between the time that it was passed in Congress, which I believe was 1972, until the time that it reached 35 states in 1980, people completely forgot about it. The Reagan period was now in vogue. Phyllis Schlafly had done a lot of damage to the perception of women seeking equality, sort of mislabeling equality as the loss of rights and privileges, which is...
Yeah, she scared women with like, you're going to have to go to war and get conscripted and all kinds of things. Yeah.
And in my film, Equal Means Equal, we talk about how the US government has the right to conscript anybody it likes. And in fact, it was about to draft nurses in the Korean War, and would certainly, if there was a draft, would certainly draft women now. The point is that all people are equal. They were created equal, and they should be seen equally by our legal system. They shouldn't be in what our lawyer Wendy Murphy calls a gender apartheid, where you have one class of citizen getting certain protections, and our class of citizens, women, getting substandard protections, no guarantee of equal protection, which is why we were raped and murdered and abused at such a high rate, because the consequences for those actions are quite minimal.
Yeah, I mean, in the UK now they're talking about those as hate crimes against women. And technically they are, but there is no like hate crime law in America protecting women.
That's because we're not a protected class, because we are still sort of seen as this strange we fall under intermediate scrutiny, a classification they devised only for us and bastards. That's women and bastards are intermediate, receive intermediate scrutiny, while people fighting under the classification of race, religion, national origin are all under strict scrutiny. And strict scrutiny is the gold standard for protecting people that are discriminated against. And that's what the ERA promises us, is strict scrutiny. And that's why we need it so desperately.
So in 1980, it got to 35 states, and it needed 3 more states, and it was forgotten. And it was, there was a successful campaign to stop it. And then what brought you to this fight? What was the genesis of your film and your Kickstarter?
So I thought that we were equal. Like many people of our generation, we assumed not only were we equal, we were far superior in some areas. And, we were raised by mothers that were feminists. So were the men of our era. So we didn't really think much of it. But you would look around society and you would see, well, how is that then? If we're equal, how come we're not getting paid the same? How come if I'm pregnant, I have to beg for a bathroom break? How come childcare is just automatically assumed to be my responsibility? All these things that didn't quite gel. And it turns out that lack of legal underpinning, that lack of explicit equality in our Constitution, is the reason for all this social discrimination that we see. I just felt like, certainly in our business in Hollywood, the sexism was so rampant and so disturbing. I was, as an actress, it was very difficult to navigate the waters from in the late 80s and 90s all the way through till, I would say, 5 minutes ago, with just the pass that the men would get of treating women, even the cast, the casting couch and the producers and the agents, all of it. And it really, really bothered me. So when I found out in 2000, I was showing my film, A Single Woman, which was my first feature um, film about Jeanette Rankin. I was showing it at the Smithsonian, and they were doing an exhibit called Women of Our Time. And a reenactress playing Alice Paul walked up to me and said, "I'm back to haunt you because you've done nothing to ratify the ERA, and women in this country are still not equal." And I just couldn't believe it. I was sure that she was wrong. So from that night forward, I like to call it, like, that was the moment where the sort of the earth opened up and swallowed me up, and I realized nothing can or should be done in terms of women's rights or environmental rights or children's rights or animals or anything until we solve this basic fundamental exclusion of women. Because and then I said to myself, well, how's it connected? What are the areas in society where this is connected? And I started to do some research, and I literally found that it was connected to every social ill. I had, I think, 28 subject areas initially. I had a 780-page script, initially looking at how does a lack of legal equality impact X in our society negatively, right? And I had to bring it down in the final film to about 10 or 12, but it really is like the invisible web that has us held where we are. And I honestly felt that I could not do anything but this, because everything else is kind of fake. It's kind of like, glazing the windows on a skyscraper that is built on quicksand. Why do we think that all these things happen? It's because we were explicitly denied equality when this country was created. When we wrote our Constitution, women were property. They were property of their fathers and subsequently property of their husbands. We never did anything to address that basic philosophy that's kind of built into the cake that is America. We did it with slavery, where we said, you know what, that cake tastes bad. Let's remake the cake. But we didn't do it when it came to women. And that's the sour taste that we're all experiencing.
Yeah, you're seeing that in the argument from the Georgia judge about abortion, about how when he threw out the 6-week ban, he was like, women are not community property, and you're right. That's kind of baked into the legal system for decades and generations and centuries. And the ERA is meant to, wash that away, like have a new legal standard going forward. So in terms of like raising the funds for Kickstarter, making the film, how did that lead to 3 more states ratifying the ERA, so you could get to the 3/4 of the states? I personally was involved in calling Virginia because that was the last state, and I grew up in Virginia, so I felt very strongly about that. But I'll talk about that after you answer.
So one of the things that I discovered was that I believe it was 1994, the 27th Amendment was ratified. And that amendment was actually written by James Madison. And so feminists all over the country were like, wait a minute, that was 203 years ago. And that's still okay to get the last state 203 years later, and you're fine with that. But for us, we had to stop after 7 years, extended to 10. That doesn't make sense. Nowhere in the Constitution does it provide for a deadline. And I'll say this, what the reason for that the deadline placed on the Equal Rights Amendment is invalid, unconstitutional, is because number one, it was placed in the preamble of the amendment, so no states voted on it. But more importantly, the entire amendatory process is a balance between the federal government and the states. And the federal government passed the ERA and the president signed the ERA. It went to the states. If the federal government could then decide that one amendment will get 200 years and another one will get 2 years, that completely imbalances the power between the federal government and the states, which is antithetical to Article 5 of our Constitution. So we decided, so there were some young female law students that took a look at that and they said, this is some bullshit here. We believe that the ERA is still viable and that they wrote a paper called the three-state strategy. When I stepped into this fight, everybody, and I'm talking about the entire pink ribbon feminist establishment, the NOWs, the feminist majorities, the whoever they were, they all believed the ERA was dead. They did not want to take it back up, and they were working on things like the Violence Against Women Act, the Equal Pay Act, the Pregnancy Discrimination Act, which again is putting windows and glazing in a shaky skyscraper built on quicksand. Who gives a shit about your acts and your statutes if the basic foundational law that Alito mentions is not there? The textual basis for our equality is not there. So I disagreed with that philosophy. And so I also disagreed with starting over, which one of my initial allies was Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, who's a lovely person. I worked with her for quite some time, but she wanted to start the entire process over again. She had a bill where she had rewritten the Equal Rights Amendment, added the word woman into the thing, and it all seemed designed to perpetuate a situation instead of end it. And so from my point of view, we really just had to get these last three states. And so I made the film with the goal of using it because it's so hard when you run into somebody at the coffee shop. They don't believe you, first of all, that women are unequal. And then you have to spend 2.5 hours like proving it to them. And then even so, they'll go home and their husband will tell you they're wrong. So I thought we need something that can be used, something definitive, something that cannot be argued, something well researched and documented that's got all the, you've got an argument, we've got the rebuttal, And so it took me about 7 years to make the film, but I wanted it to be like the end, like here it is, this is why it has to happen. Now let's go and use it. And so I had hoped that it would be taken up by the ERA coalition, which I was a founding member of, and the feminist majority and so forth. But again, I found that, my goals were not in alignment with their goals, despite on the surface appearing to all want the same thing. They didn't want it done the way I wanted to get it done, which was as fast as possible and as definitive as possible. I'm not interested. At the time, I was like, let me get the hell out of this whole mess and back to my acting career. I'm not here to become the next feminist majority. I'm here to get the goddamn ERA settled so that I can get a part and not get manhandled, so that I can, whatever it is, right? But that didn't turn out to be the case. So I was sort of compelled in a way to turn the film Equal Means Equal to the national nonprofit Equal Means Equal, because I ended up having to take the film out myself to all the different unratified state legislatures and use it as a tool to convince them to take it back up and vote on it. The first ally that did an amazing job to get the ball rolling was State Senator Patricia Spearman of Nevada, who is a Black gay minister, veteran. And she luckily had at the time a majority female state legislature in Nevada and was able to get Republican women and Democratic women to work together to vote on ratifying the ERA. As soon as Nevada ratified, there was a lot of excitement. Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney got a letter from the U.S. archivist that said, yes, if you're able to get the final 3 states, the ERA will be law and I will publish it. So we dedicated ourselves for the next many years to going to these different states and trying. We tried in Arizona, we tried in Missouri, we tried in every possible state that we could, but where we succeeded was in Illinois in 2018. So Nevada, the film was released in 2016. Nevada ratified in 2017. Illinois ratified in 2018. And then we were sort of in a little bit of a holding pattern because Virginia, as you know, was the state legislature of Virginia had been held in place by a series of very racist, misogynistic men who were in control of all the committees that could ostensibly vote on the Equal Rights Amendment. They would never let it out of committee. So we actually moved to Virginia because we were like, okay, how are we going to get, because Virginia was really our best chance at becoming the final state. So we moved there and partnered with local on the ground activists. And this is where the ERA struggle in our iteration was much more intersectional. So we worked with a lot of Black activist groups. We worked with a lot of gay activist groups. It was everybody is invited, men, everybody's invited to this. And I think that really helped. And we managed to get rid of these incumbents that had been there for 25, 29 years that were responsible for gerrymandering their districts to such a point that if you were a Black person, you might as well throw your vote in the garbage because it would have absolutely no effect. The year that I moved there was the first and possibly only year that the gerrymandered maps were no longer in play because the Supreme Court itself had said, my God, these things are so gerrymandered, so illegal. So we spent a lot of time educating the African American community in Virginia about how much their vote would count this year. And not only would it count for Virginia, but if they did vote, it would help the women of America and be historic. So that we spent, a lot of time doing that. And we successfully removed all the obstacles that were standing in the way of getting the ERA voted on in Virginia. And in fact, it was the first yes vote when the new state Congress came in. And then we thought, wow, let's throw a ticker tape parade. Woohoo, we're equal. We were so excited. We were literally planning a parade when Donald Trump ordered his attorney general, the disgraceful Bill Barr, to send a letter to the archivist ordering them not to publish the Equal Rights Amendment under threat of losing their job and God knows what else. So our attorney, who predicted that this was going to happen, she's a brilliant lawyer, you should have her on. She was responsible for Obama's Dear Colleague letter. She's fought. She is the head attorney, professor of law at New England Law, Boston. And she knew that they weren't going to let this happen as easily as the rest of us thought. And so she was ready, and we filed a lawsuit immediately demanding that the archivist publish the amendment as required. Equal means equal versus the U.S. archivist. About a month later, the states of Virginia, Illinois, and Nevada filed the same suit against the archivist. And what's really dismaying and shocking is that both suits were dismissed for lack of standing, meaning that this is after years in court. And, our lawyer, Wendy Murphy, took it all the way to the Supreme Court where it was not accepted. Lack of standing simply means that they're not even going to address the merits of the case or what we're talking about. They're just going to say, you don't have a right to ask this question. So if equal means equal, which sued on behalf of women as a class. So if women as a class don't have a right to demand equal rights from their government, and the states that voted, the majority of their constituents voted for something, and they represent the women of their states, they also don't have that right. So it begs the question, who does have the right to speak for women if we don't have those rights ourselves? And that question remains to be answered.
I wanted to go back to the Virginia fight because it really was an eye-opener for me as a person who'd grown up in Virginia. And I think this might be helpful for other people, like wanting to get to know more about, where the power lays in their states. I remember when you put out the call to call the Republican head of the committee who was keeping the amendment from even being voted on in the House of Delegates. And I spoke to his secretary or somebody in the front office. I have never been condescended to so much in my life by somebody who's supposed to be representing us. And I was mad after that. And so when you put out the call to start calling to get Democrats elected, and I was still an independent at this point, to get Democrats elected into the House of Delegates, I did a bunch of phone banks because this was ridiculous. But having grown up there and being kind of politically savvy about national politics, I had no idea that there were so many people running Richmond who have been there for decades and decades and decades and causing all kinds of malfeasance, And I was so grateful when they were voted out, and they did all kinds of great things. The first thing they did was pass the Equal Rights Amendment, which, I was like you. I was like, this is it, we're done. But they also passed like gun safety laws and all kinds of other things that were so good for the people of Virginia. It was like a whole wave of good things happened as a result of your activism and the intersectional activism happening on the ground of all these groups coming into their power, on the ground in Virginia. And you saw a difference at the grassroots in Virginia as a result of this fight. So I am grateful to you and to your team for living there for a year and being instrumental in making this happen, because it made my state a better place to live, a better place to grow up for people, after me. And I just wanted to say thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Do you
Yeah.
feel like it's gone backwards now, though?
Well, it did go back to Republicans for a bit, and then it came back to Democrats. But the thing is, it's going back and forth.
Absolutely. Because those guys that were entrenched, they really thought that they could never be moved out.
Yes.
The condescension, and they would literally laugh in our faces, like literally laugh at us. They were throwing white power signs on the floor of the Capitol. It was really kind of terrifying. When I moved there were people that, because a lot of the people that we worked with were Black. There were people, because I didn't know, I had never been to Virginia and didn't know anything about it. When I rented the Airbnb house that became our headquarters, I just worked with our friend Katie Hornung, who was VA Ratify ERA, and we picked this house. I didn't know that it was so segregated that literally people that came over that would do like, whatever activities we were doing at the house. A lot of people that came over were Black, had grown up in there, in that town. This was Suffolk County. They had literally never been on that street. They were not allowed to buy a house on that street. When the swimming pool was ordered to be integrated, the people in that neighborhood filled it with cement to avoid having to share it with other people. I honestly had never experienced that. I had been, I'm from New York City, like, and then LA, and I grew up in Caracas, Venezuela. And so I really had never been in a place where the racism was just part of, like, even the Black people thought it was perfectly normal for the way people behaved. And I felt ill. I was ill. I was so disturbed by it. So I'm very glad that we were effective. We really, really worked very hard. We were at the Walmart parking lots every day. We were at the Friday night football games. We threw Sunday dinners. We were everywhere. We were at barber shops. We were at laundromats. We went everywhere and talked to everybody. We went to housing, public housing. We gave out food at the end of every Sunday. When if we had food left over from our dinners, we'd go and give them to poor people that didn't have food, and we'd still talk to them. And we registered a lot of people to vote that had never registered before.
Yeah.
So
Growing up, you just never heard anything about politics in Richmond, which was, growing up as a politics nerd, thinking back on that, it was like, oh, they just kept everything really quiet. They didn't really want you to know what was going on. And that was just the way you grew up. That's what you thought it was supposed to be. And then you like put the word out. They're not publishing the ERA. They're not even letting it up for a vote. And I'm like, that was the first I'd heard. Oh, this is what they're really doing, you know? And, just bringing those things to awareness is so powerful. Just letting people know, because yeah, when you grew up like that, you don't know any different, you know? Um, but
another scary thing that we found out, which we actually used to our advantage, was that the guy that we were trying to get rid of, who had been an incumbent for 29 years and who also drew the maps that were so gerrymandered, he owned a small pharmacy in town, and that pharmacy dispensed 4 million opioid pills a year.
wow.
So, which is more than people. Every man, woman, child, and baby had to be taking 4 of those things a day for it to even make any sense. And with all the opioid death that was going on at the time, I hear it's gotten quite a bit better. We found a way to also expose that the week before the election, expose that this guy, not only does he not treat Black people properly, not only is he withholding equality from women, he's also murdering a lot of people with his tiny little, homespun pharmacy. He's dispensing for all these opioids. So that was a big article in the Sunday paper before the election, 2-page spread about it. We did a vigil outside, it was like, we were like, because sometimes I feel like people of goodwill or people who want the best for everyone don't want to fight the same game that these people are fighting. These people don't have scruples. They laugh at scruples. They make fun of us because we believe that there should be values and principles. But sometimes when you want the greater good, you do have to fight back quite viciously. And we did in Virginia. We were vicious.
And I, I wouldn't say that's vicious. I would say that's righteous, because he's a drug dealer.
Exactly.
just like anybody we put in prison for drug dealing, that's drug dealing. Um, so, um, and there is that intersection of like, when you don't want women's rights, you don't want minorities to have rights, the racism, the like keeping people down. Um, and I don't think, I don't, I think women especially, and I'm going to say like as a white woman who's also Hispanic, but I get the benefit of appearing white, don't realize how like we have a certain amount of privilege, and to keep that privilege, sometimes white women act racist or other people, and it divides women between white and black. But even like white women, we don't, you know, we're not getting equal pay, even though we're getting paid more maybe than black or Latinas. We still don't have the same rights for, pregnancy rights, or all the, friends who know they're not going to get hired because they're pregnant, or know that they're somehow going to be let go in the industry because they're pregnant. The um and I nowadays I struggle with like, why isn't it more obvious? But I guess we still have to explain, like, passing the ERA would make a qualitative difference in women's lives and society's lives and children's lives and anybody who loves a woman's life. Because I hear the argument from people who are pretty smart, who've got PhDs in poli sci, men and women, that it's not going to make a difference. Passing the ERA is not going to make a difference, and I know it's going to make a huge difference. But what do you say to that argument? Because it's I
Well,
don't
we
know
know
where that argument comes from, even.
I think it's part of, it's part of the plan, like if you can say that. But we know for a fact that the US government saves, I think it's $1.7 trillion a year in underpaying women for the same work or work of equal value. So we're talking the military, the post office, wherever there is a government worker, she is being paid less than her male counterpart by the US government, which may be one of the reasons that they collude with the corporations to keep the ERA from being published and adopted. But as the day that this thing is in the books is the day that people like Lilly Ledbetter, but their government counterparts immediately have to be paid properly. And we sent letters to the attorneys general in all 50 states saying, are you reviewing your labor laws and other laws to ensure that they are complying with equal rights and protections as required under the Equal Rights Amendment? Because so 2 years after January 27th, 2020, the ERA, according to the law, must be adopted and enforced. And that day came and went, and we don't see any of these states adopting or enforcing. For any of these, abortion bans would be illegal because the ERA says you cannot do something to a woman that you cannot equally do to a man. So if you want to tell men that they must have vasectomies or they may not get a prescription for Viagra, then you may be able to argue that you can have some effect on women's choices with their reproductive rights. But since that's never going to happen, it means that you cannot tell a woman what she can or cannot do with her body, not under privacy, which was how it worked under Roe, but under equality, because you're doing it only to her. She's the only one experiencing these things. Therefore, it cannot be done. So if people don't think it would have an effect, talk to the 11-year-old child that was raped by her stepfather that then has to carry that baby, or the woman in the parking lot bleeding out because they won't do a D&C. Well, those things cannot happen, would not happen, should not happen, will not happen. And what really bugs me and our lawyer, Wendy Murphy, and my vice president, Natalie White, is that when when the ERA was ratified by the final state. Prior to that, we had had a public panel conversation where Ellie Smeal from the feminist majority was there, and our lawyer said, as soon as this thing happens, we have to file lawsuits, hundreds and hundreds of lawsuits, using the federal ERA. And Ellie Smeal said, I'm gathering a team of lawyers now. Well, guess what? As soon as it happened, not only did she not gather a team of lawyers, she wouldn't sign on to an amicus brief supporting our case. She called up other people, told them not to sign on to our case, and she's done absolutely zero, which is why you're seeing we've intervened in some of these more egregious cases because they are not using the federal ERA to make the case. In some states, the state ERAs have actually protected the women from these abortion, bans. But the fact of the matter is, we have the federal Equal Rights Amendment. Why isn't the ACLU using that? Why aren't they demanding strict scrutiny? Why? And I don't want to sound like a conspiracy theorist, but something in the milk ain't white here, that we are so far down this road that this thing happened and everybody, and I'm talking men, women, powerful, the powers that be are turning their backs on what is the silver bullet to protect women and LGBTQ people from this kind of human rights rollbacks that we're seeing just increase every day. It's very frightening to me that I find myself not only fighting the guys like the people in Virginia, but I'm also fighting, the people that you look at that everybody goes, oh, that's the biggest feminist ever. The Ruth Bader Ginsburg that said, that commented on the case when she shouldn't have, when she knew the case that we had filed, and she still said, no, you got to start over. That was like, there's something going on. And Wendy did a very researched article into what's going on beneath this, right? So there is the financial aspect. There is the fact that the government will lose a lot of money when this happens. The corporations will have to pay women properly. I won't call it lose a lot of money because we all know that when women make money, the economy grows because women spend the money. But still, they're very frightened of that. And then there's something that's less quantifiable, which I would say is the sort of genetic sense that the society has that men are superior, that men must be in control, and that this is going to start to undermine and unravel the human being's sort of set point, right? And I would argue, if that's how you feel, and I do see that in people, I would argue, don't you think the set point needs to be reset at this point? Don't you see what's going on? How long do you think this species is going to survive if we continue with this sort of amoral, philosophic sort of, I don't even know what to call where we are, but our self-loathing that extends to the way we treat everything in the world? How long do you think we're going to make it? Or do you just want to go to Mars? Do you think that that's the answer? You're going to go to Mars, you and a couple of your buddies and a few Victoria's Secrets models, and you'll be fine. And everybody else can just, die a horrible death, drowning or, whatever.
What was really shocking, and I remember seeing your movie the first time, Equal Means Equal, was the Supreme Court case about the woman who lost her 3 children. I'm going to do a trigger warning, people, for people here who don't want something quite horrific to hear something quite horrific. But this was galvanizing to me because it really showed in stark relief how women don't have equal rights to even protect their children. And did you want to talk about it, or I can introduce it?
Sure.
Or
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely. You should talk about this. Is Jessica Gonzalez Lanahan, but I also want to bring up my dear friend Dee Geese, who has a very similar case that's been going on for years, and she just heard from the Supreme Court yesterday, and her case has been dismissed and denied. And she was raped by a powerful man, and he didn't want to pay child support. And so he actually went to Virginia to get himself a good old judge that would take her custody rights away. And she hasn't been able to see her child in 18 years because he didn't want to pay child support. Instead, after raping her, impregnating her, he now molests the child. And there's just nothing she can do. He's a powerful attorney, a senior partner at a big law firm. And they said to her, they admitted that that the guy told, so I'll just read you this, that when the rapist was ordered to pay child support and underwent court paternity testing twice due to his objections, he hired Top Gun lawyers to hop the Potomac from DC Superior Court to bribe Judge Nolan Dawkins and Alexandria, Virginia courts, and promised Judge Dawkins to call my Republican friends in Richmond and get you appointed to the higher circuit court. And they admitted this in transcript, and that's exactly what happened. And she, the rapist spent over $1 million litigating, and she lost the case. And she's a poor woman. She had to represent herself. She couldn't afford the lawyers. And she's never had any, there's never, she has a perfect record, and they still took her child away. And both her and the child have been subjected to violence, rape, sexual abuse of the baby. Courts ignored all evidence. And even the psychiatric evidence that said that the guy was severely mentally ill, psychotic, delusional, and severely aggressive. So this is not just Jessica, and she's considering going to the International Criminal Court now because she's gone to the Supreme Court twice, just like Jessica Lanahan Gonzalez, who had a restraining order against her husband, and the husband violated the restraining order, stole the 3 children off the front lawn where they were playing. She went to the police 9 times, and they did nothing. And he ended up murdering all 3 of the children, going to the police station and getting killed himself. And she sued the police department, and the Supreme Court of the United States determined that she had no right to have her restraining order enforced. It was not mandatory. It was if they felt like it. So then the question is, why bother getting a restraining order if the police don't have to enforce it?
Yeah, and this goes to what you were speaking about before, about what do all these laws about protecting pregnant women, equal pay, Violence Against Women Act. None of these laws that are passed have teeth. Nope. Because underlying them, there is no textual basis for women not being discriminated against.
And having the equal protection of our laws, which is an important thing we don't.
Yes. And these are the most extreme cases of that. But there's a reason why women don't come forward when they've been assaulted or raped, because they know the legal system is stacked against them.
That's right.
And also the societal system of like, you're lying, you want something, your whole life is put under scrutiny, rather than the other side's life being put under scrutiny, and so when people come to you and say, and I'm talking to the listener right now, and say, this will not have a categorical difference in our lives, think about these cases, these extreme cases, where these women had no recourse under the law to protect themselves or their children from
like 90%,
monsters.
Yeah, 90% plus women are on death row that are serving very, very long prison sentences are there because they finally killed their abuser. This is somebody that their records was beating them, putting them in the hospital, hurting their children, threatening them with guns, abuse, blah, blah, blah. But when she finally shoots them in self-defense or to protect the life of her children, she ends up on death row for the rest of her life.
Or the children who've been sex trafficked, or women who've been sex trafficked, who finally snap and are violent and who are in our court system, who don't, according to the law, don't have the right to protect themselves against violence when no one else would protect them. It's an absolute scandal. And I believe, as you do, that this should be on the header of every newspaper every day until it gets passed, because it would constitute a seismic shift in women's recourse in under the law for all these other things that, it's good to pass all these other things to spell it out for people, but it needs to be based on something more.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And we just make sure people understand it has been passed.
Yes.
It's been passed. It is law. When we look back, when it's, 3035, people will, when they say, when did women get equal rights? They will say January 27th, 2020. This is all just smoke and mirrors that they're fighting against us until we get it going, which is why we all have to push really hard right now. And Kamala Harris, God bless her, be that as it may, but the fact is that President Biden has the power to make one 3-minute phone call to the archivist today. The ERA will be published. The onus will shift from us playing defense to those that believe that women are inferior and unequal, having to prove that and having to get us out of the Constitution.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that, because it's kind of confusing, right? Like, it's already the law by the way the Constitution is written, but not by the way it's being enforced by the people in the courts, in the Justice Department, in the executive, and even in the states who know better.
That's the scary part. It's very scary.
So this is kind of a down place, but I've been asking all my guests because, a lot of people are very disaffected. They're like, how can one person make a difference? And I would argue, even though you're still fighting this all these years later, you have made a tremendous difference, at least in the lives of people in Virginia and in my life and the other people's lives who are aware of this situation in a way I would never have known about the situation unless I hadn't, the meeting you was what brought me to this knowledge. Can you speak to a little bit about your belief on whether or not one person can make a difference?
Absolutely. I believe that one person can, does, and historically is the catalyst for all the greatest changes we've seen in human history. It's never sort of groupthink that makes it happen. It's always one person's strong belief and their energy and effort to make something, like Alice Paul, like any of the great people that have, like Mahatma Gandhi, my somebody that I really look up to. I think, and it also makes life so much more fun, because when you are working on something that means something to you, it's in Japanese, it's called ikigai. When you find that thing that you really want to do that feels purposeful to you, it helps you not think that life is meaningless and worthless, and you can't really be disaffected if you know that you can be effective, and you can be effective. And I encourage everybody to be effective in this particular area, because I do believe it is the a priori first action the human species has to take. Gandhi said that women were the dharma of the human species, and that once women had achieved equality and the society had treated them with respect, it would be the evolution of the species. We need to evolve. If we are, some people would say, well, maybe the human species needs to go extinct because it really hasn't successfully fulfilled its potential. It's going to go one of two ways. It's either we're going to head towards extinction or we're going to evolve. And I would love to see us evolve. I believe in it, and I hope that everyone will consider it. It's a lot of fun. You meet a lot of great people. Look at me and Carolyn. We wouldn't even know each other. And now we're bonded to one another, and we feel a sense of joint purpose. And I just invite everybody to join us at equalmeansequal.org to participate however you can, to write to me at Kamala@equalmeansequal.org, with any questions or comments. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to include you in our growing family.
Yeah, I encourage people to reach out to Kamala because she's doing amazing projects all the time to move this forward, including a project in West Hollywood. That sounds pretty exciting.
I'm so excited. It's starting this week, and it is the biggest project since the movie. We're covering a 33,000 square foot public library with images of people that we took at the Pride, LA Pride Festival. My lead advisor, Sanja Nuttall, stood there all day for 2 days and got over 600 pictures of people holding up a phone. And the call is make the call. It's 1 3-minute call, publish the ERA, and then all people will be equal. So we're installing that this week. It's going to take probably 10 to 12 days to get all the pictures up and the words up. And then it'll be up until Christmas. I encourage everybody, if you want to volunteer, please send me an email to info@equalmeansequal.org with the word volunteer. If you have any publicity abilities or know any publicity people that might want to do a story about it or come cover it, we would be very grateful. If you have the ability to broaden the message on social media, anything that you can do to help with this project would be greatly appreciative. It's appreciated. It's our goal to have Biden publish ERA before he leaves office. It will give him a legacy second only to Lincoln's in terms of importance. And it is a no-brainer. There is zero political downside for him.
What do you say to people about whether they should vote or not? Because that's something that I'm also trying to push back against, which is one vote doesn't matter. But in Virginia, it mattered quite a bit.
That's silly. That's very silly. Your vote is incredibly important because the less you vote, the more these people that are in power think that they can just run roughshod over us, that we're not aware of what's going on, that we don't care what's going on, and that we're just going to sit back and watch Netflix while they push opioids on us, take control, do whatever they want, make billions of dollars, give every, billions of dollars of government subsidies to a Canadian guy who wants to take us all to Mars and has 12 kids by 5 women, whatever. Let's be sensible. Your vote is your voice. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for because frankly, our choices are quite grim. But if you do get involved, maybe we can vote for you. You know what I mean? Like, let's get some better people. Let's get a better system. Let's get money out of politics. There is no reason whatsoever that the entire focus of anybody that wants to run for office has to be raising money, because that immediately puts them into a stream of people that have an agenda that are going to exact that agenda from you should you get elected. Money's got to be out. If we're talking about democracy, then money cannot be part of it because it's completely undemocratic. It gives more weight to the voices of those with the capital than the rest of us. But that's not to say that your voice doesn't count. your voice does count, and it's very important that you vote, especially if you're a woman, a gay person, or you care about women or gay people.
Yeah. This is something I've enjoyed asking my guests because there's, I think, as many answers as there are people. What does democracy mean to you?
Equality, of course. Equal means equal. Otherwise, we could all, I could be the Queen of Sheba. That'd be great too. But, we're not in a kingdom. We're not in a dictatorship. We're in a democracy because we want everybody's voice to count. We want everybody to be treated equally under our laws. And right now, that is not what is going on, and it's not okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's what this fight is about. It's pro-democracy in the very definitional sense of it. Like until we have equality, we don't really have a true democracy.
That's absolutely right.
Oh, I've so enjoyed this conversation with you, Kamala.
Me too.
And to our audience, please remember your values, your voice, and your vote matter. One citizen can make a difference. And who knows, you too may help pass an amendment to the Constitution that makes our democracy even more equal for everyone. Thank you for listening to this interview. I wanted to leave my audience with a call to action, but for most of us, next steps aren't obvious. So I wanted to leave you with some advice from 2021 Nobel laureate Maria Ressa. From her 2020 Princeton commencement speech, she gave about living your way to next actions. Here's the advice. 1, make the choice to learn. Or in my words, when in doubt, choose the path of learning. 2, embrace your fear. And this is when I need to follow myself. Don't let your fear run you. Instead, turn around and face it head on. 3, build your community, but beware the mob. In my words, the internet amplifies the mob, so make sure you're building a community online and in real life, which amplifies the best in each and every one of us instead of the worst. And one last thought. President Biden is still president until January 20th, 2025. In a public letter to President Joe Biden, Michael Moore recommends that number 1 on Biden's presidential bucket list should be to call the Archivist of the United States and publish the 28th Amendment once and for all.